Imagine this. It is a cold dawn in a royal palace, the kind of morning where the corridors echo with silence, broken only by the hurried footsteps of midwives and the creak of heavy doors. In the bedchamber, behind embroidered curtains and guarded by anxious attendants, a queen writhes in agony. Her child is about to be born, an heir, a continuation of the dynasty, a hope for the kingdom. But what emerges from that womb is not a cry of triumph. It is a whimper, thin and broken, as if the child himself is unsure whether he belongs among the living. The attending physicians lean in, exchanging glances. Something is terribly wrong. The infant, a prince by blood and title, does not flail his arms. He does not stretch his legs. His body bends like wax beneath their hands. His tiny frame is unable to hold itself upright. One horrified midwife whispers a phrase that will echo through the palace for decades to come. The birth of a prince should have been a cause for celebration. Bells should have rung in the cathedral. Courtiers should have showered the palace with gifts, and the people should have filled the streets with cheers of a future king. But in this case, there were no bells, no cheering crowds, only whispers, low, uneasy, dangerous whispers that slipped like shadows through the corridors of the palace. At first, the court tried to pretend that everything was fine. The Queen's ladies-in-waiting were instructed not to speak of the child's condition. The physicians were commanded to use vague phrases, delicate, weakly, needing rest. Official documents described him as frail of constitution, but never more than that. To the outside world, a prince had been born. That was enough. But inside the palace walls, people knew the truth. This was not a child who seemed built to survive. And in courts, truth is never simply truth. It becomes rumor. It becomes accusation. It becomes weapon. The whispers began with the servants. They saw what others didn't. The nurses struggling to lift the infant, the pillows carefully arranged to keep his tiny frame from collapsing inward. The strange silence of a nursery that should have been filled with cries and laughter, but instead echoed with only muffled footsteps and the rustle of linens. One maid is said to have written in a letter to her cousin, "The prince does not lie, as other infants do. His head droops, his body bends, and when he is held, he seems as though he might fold into himself. They tell us not to speak of it, but even the walls must know by now." That letter, smuggled out of the palace, became the first spark. Soon, rumors fanned into flame. Courtiers whispered of curses, of divine punishment, of the sins of the king being visited upon his son. But here's where it gets worse. In a royal court, where every alliance depends on marriage and every dynasty depends on heirs, the body of a child was not just flesh, it was a political weapon. Ambassadors from neighboring kingdoms began reporting strange observations in their letters. One envoy from Venice wrote back to his doge, "The prince is not as others. His body seems fragile, his form unnatural. It is whispered he cannot grow to manhood. The succession here may not be secure." These letters circulated quietly, but powerfully. Foreign courts began recalculating their strategies. Was this dynasty strong, or was it rotting from within? Meanwhile, inside the palace, the queen was said to be both fiercely protective and desperately ashamed. Chroniclers describe her obsession with keeping her son hidden from view, excusing him from ceremonies, refusing to let him be displayed on balconies, as healthy heirs usually were. At one celebration, when foreign dignitaries expected to see the newborn, the queen ordered the curtains drawn and announced the boy was too unwell to appear. The dignitaries exchanged glances. "Too unwell" was the phrase that echoed through the corridors for months. Too unwell to ride in a carriage, too unwell to be shown at mass, too unwell to even be glimpsed by his own people. But secrecy in a palace is like a dam holding back a river. The more you try to contain it, the more pressure builds. Soon, even the king's own advisors began murmuring that the boy might not survive long enough to inherit the throne. And here's the dangerous part. When courtiers start to believe a child will never grow into a king, their loyalty begins to shift. Ambitious cousins, rival claimants, and foreign powers suddenly see opportunity. The whispers grew bolder. What if the prince dies? Who inherits? Perhaps the king's brother should prepare himself. Perhaps another line should be strengthened. The court, once united around the birth of an heir, was now splitting into factions, and the fragile body of a child was the fault line. One ambassador from France recorded an especially cutting remark. It is said the prince was born without bones. If such is true, then the kingdom itself rests on jelly. This was more than mockery. It was prophecy. If the prince could not stand, how could the dynasty? And yet, the boy lived. That was the strange, unnerving truth. Despite his deformities, despite his frailty, despite every whisper predicting his death, he survived those early years. Doctors prodded him, priests prayed over him, courtiers mocked him in private. But still he drew breath, and the long "he has no bones." Of course the prince had bones, but they were fragile, twisted, and malformed beyond what the eye expected. His limbs curved unnaturally, his ribs seemed too soft, his head appeared larger than it should. To those present, it looked as though the very structure of his body was missing, as if the boy had been born in defiance of the natural order. Word spread quickly through the palace halls. Servants whispered in corners, while nobles exchanged letters filled with dread. An heir born weak, fragile, and possibly deformed was more than just a private tragedy. It was a public scandal. In a world where monarchies relied on strength, lineage, and physical presence, a prince without bones was not just a child with an illness. He was a threat to the dynasty itself. The royal physicians were the first to act. They documented his condition carefully, writing in the coded, cautious language of the court. The infant shows signs of weakness in the limbs and softness in the bones, which may render his development uncertain. Behind these polite words lay fear. The truth, spoken openly, would have been dangerous, that this child might never walk, never ride a horse, never command an army, never even sit a throne. The queen herself, whose name was etched in court chronicles as a woman of strong will, fell into despair. She had endured the agony of childbirth, only to be presented with whispers of a cursed heir. One court lady recorded in her private notes, "Her Majesty did not hold the child for long. She looked upon him, and her face fell pale, as though she had seen a ghost. For what mother wishes to cradle the death of her dynasty?" This reaction was not mere cruelty. For queens, their bodies were political machines. To produce a strong male heir was their ultimate duty. To fail was to invite ridicule, suspicion, and sometimes even deposition. The queen knew what this frailty meant. Her power, her standing, her very marriage. Everything now trembled on the edge of collapse. But the scandal did not remain inside the palace walls. Foreign ambassadors, always hungry for gossip, caught wind of the situation. A Venetian envoy reported back to his masters. The newborn prince appears to suffer from a condition of the bones, which makes him most delicate. His survival is uncertain, and the court whispers that the kingdom may yet be without an heir. Across Europe, rival courts smirked in private. A weak heir in one dynasty could mean opportunities for another. The prince's very existence became fodder for political maneuvering, alliances reconsidered, marriages delayed, treaties questioned. The whisper of sin, and then came the darker rumors. Some said the child was a punishment from God, a sign of hidden sin in the royal bloodline. Others pointed to the long history of intermarriage among kings and queens, whispering that perhaps the family had twisted itself into ruin. One bishop, speaking in confidence to a courtier, declared, "The Lord does not fashion princes without bones unless he wishes to show mankind the frailty of pride." In taverns and markets, the people took the story further. They spoke of witchcraft, of curses, of secret poisons slipped into the queen's cup. A prince without bones was not merely a sickly infant. It was an omen, a warning that the kingdom itself was built on fragile foundations. The cradle of shadows as weeks passed. The child remained alive, but only barely. He was swaddled in silks, kept away from drafts, guarded constantly. His cradle was a gilded cage, lined with cushions to protect his fragile frame. Nurses rocked him gently, afraid that even the act of holding him might cause harm. Every cry he made sounded brittle, every breath a reminder that his body was weaker than it should have been. The palace doctors began to speak in hushed tones of rickets, fragility, malformations. They prescribed strange remedies, powdered bones of animals, elixirs of mercury and wine, ointments blessed by priests. None of it worked. The prince's condition seemed beyond medicine, beyond prayer, beyond hope, the shadow of what was to come. And yet, despite all this, the child lived. Against the predictions of physicians and the cruel whispers of courtiers, he survived his first months. But his survival was not a blessing. It was a growing curse. Each day that he lingered, the dynasty was forced to reckon with the impossible. Question: what do you do with a prince who cannot stand? What happens to a kingdom when its future is born without the strength to rule? The scandal of his birth was only the beginning, because as the prince grew, so too did the nightmare. By the time the prince reached the age when most children were taking their first unsteady steps, the palace already knew something was very wrong. He did not crawl. He did not attempt to walk. He barely sat upright without collapsing sideways, as though his body had betrayed him from the start. Imagine the scene: golden tapestries, marble floors, nurses in crisp gowns rushing to help. Yet in the middle of it all, the heir to the dynasty lay limp in his crib, unable to hold his own weight. Court physicians wrote reports in stiff Latin, describing the boy as delicate beyond reason, his bones as if softened, pliable like wax. Others whispered he was a child without bones. His mother wept in private. His father, however, refused to accept weakness in a son destined to rule. But here's where it gets worse. In public ceremonies, the young prince was paraded before the nobility. Servants would discreetly strap him to stiff wooden supports, hidden beneath layers of royal robes so he could appear upright. The illusion of strength mattered more than the child's suffering. Diplomats noted the boy's pale, fragile face, and some wrote home that the kingdom's future was built on a body too weak to carry its own crown. As the years passed, the prince's body grew, but his strength did not. He was carried more often than he walked. When tutors came to teach him riding or swordplay, skills expected of all royal heirs, the lessons ended in humiliation. His hands trembled, his legs buckled, and sometimes he fainted under the sun. Whispers spread. Was this a punishment from God, a curse upon the dynasty? The boy himself began to understand. In letters preserved from his tutors, we read that he asked questions no child should have to ask. Why can they walk and I cannot? Why must my bones bend when theirs are straight? And still, the court pressed on with the performance. Dinners, audiences, feasts. The fragile child was dressed in velvet and jewels, displayed like a relic rather than a person. One ambassador wrote, "It is as if the prince is a doll, propped up by unseen hands. Yet in his eyes burns a sad intelligence, as though he knows he is both heir and prisoner." By now, the scandal was no longer private. Europe's courts whispered about the heir who could not stand. And the darker question loomed: how long could a monarchy survive when its future king was too fragile to even walk among his people? Because this was only the beginning. By the time the young prince was crowned, the court had perfected the art of illusion. Every weakness, every tremor, every faltering step was carefully hidden beneath layers of ceremony. To the people, he appeared regal. But behind palace walls, the truth was more tragic. At the coronation, the hall glittered with gold. Bells rang across the city. Nobles bowed low as choirs filled the air with hymns of glory. Yet, if you looked closely, you would have seen the truth. The boy king could not stand for long. Beneath his heavy robes, iron braces pressed against his legs. Behind the throne, attendants stood ready to catch him should his body fail. This was the monarchy's greatest secret. The throne itself became a stage. Foreign envoys, trained to notice the smallest detail, recorded strange observations. One Venetian diplomat wrote, "He looked as though the crown weighed more than his body could bear." Another whispered that the boy seemed less a ruler, more a ghost clothed in velvet. The pressure was unbearable. Kings were meant to be warriors, commanders, symbols of strength. But here was a sovereign who could barely lift a sword. His father's ghost lingered in every comparison. The mighty ruler who had conquered armies, now followed by a child, who could not even ride a horse. And yet the court spun stories. Preachers claimed his suffering was divine, a sign of God's chosen king. Scholars said his frailty made him closer to the heavens. The more his body failed, the more they insisted his spirit was unbreakable. It was propaganda dressed as faith. But illusions can only stretch so far. Behind the silk curtains, the truth leaked out. Servants spoke of nights when the king gasped for breath, unable to rise from his bed. Rumors spread of seizures, of fevers that lasted weeks. The people began to wonder, if their king could not even command his own body, how could he command a kingdom? Even in his portraits, painted by the finest artists of the age, the deception continued. The king was always shown tall, confident, draped in armor, or seated with a sword at his side. Yet those who saw him in person knew the truth. The armor was too heavy. The sword never swung in battle. His reign became a performance, every event a carefully choreographed display to disguise the monarchy's deepest fear, that the dynasty was crumbling from within. But history is cruel. And though the court hid his weakness behind robes and crowns, whispers of his condition only grew louder. Foreign rulers called him the Shadow King. To his enemies, he was not a threat, but a tragic figure, a monarch held together not by strength, but by secrecy. And still, the illusion had to continue, because if the truth were fully revealed, the dynasty itself might not survive. The deeper one peers into the ancestry of this tragic king, the clearer the shadows become. His weakness was not a curse of chance, but the predictable result of a dynasty that had defied the natural order for centuries. The royal bloodline was famed for its obsession with purity. Cousins married cousins. Uncles married nieces. Generations folded in upon themselves, until the family tree looked less like a branching oak and more like a tightly wound coil. The purpose was simple: keep power within the dynasty, preserve the sacred blood of kings. But the result was catastrophic. By the time of our king's birth, the family had already been riddled with strange deformities, sudden deaths, and endless miscarriages. Doctors of the era, baffled by so much sickness, whispered that the family was cursed. Today, historians and geneticists know the truth. The dynasty had collapsed under the weight of its own inbreeding. One feature in particular became infamous: the Habsburg jaw, a grotesquely enlarged lower jaw that made speech and eating difficult. Portraits of this king show the condition at its most extreme. His mouth permanently misaligned, his features almost caricatured by the weight of generations of incest. It wasn't just a physical deformity, it was a symbol of centuries of obsession, pride, and reckless ambition. But the shadows ran deeper than appearances. This king was the product of not one, but multiple overlapping genetic lines. His parents were uncle and niece. His grandparents were similarly entangled. In fact, scholars calculate that he inherited more genetic similarity than if he had been born of siblings. His very DNA was a collapsing empire, and the consequences showed in every part of his life. His body frail, his mind clouded, his health in constant crisis. He was not a ruler born of divine blessing, but of scientific tragedy. centuries before science could explain it. The court, of course, refused to see it that way. They wrapped his suffering in divine language. Priests declared his suffering proof of holiness. Ministers insisted his birth was a miracle, but behind those words lay a fear no one dared speak aloud. What if the dynasty itself was dying? Foreign observers saw what the court denied. Letters from French and English envoys described him bluntly: incapable, weak, a monarch doomed from the start. Some even predicted the end of his bloodline before it happened. They were right. For centuries, kings had expanded empires, conquered lands, and left behind heirs. But this king would do none of that. His blood was too poisoned, his body too broken. And though his reign was wrapped in ceremony and prayer, the shadows of the bloodline were inescapable. This was not just the tragedy of a boy king. It was the tragedy of an empire that destroyed itself in the name of purity, leaving behind a ruler who was less a monarch and more a symbol of collapse. Behind the gilded walls of Madrid, the king's court was less a place of governance and more a theatre of lies. Ministers whispered, factions schemed, and courtiers bowed with false smiles while sharpening daggers behind their backs. Everyone knew the king could not rule, but no one dared admit it openly. Priests declared every fainting spell, every seizure, as divine trials. Ministers fought not for the empire, but for their own fortunes. Foreign ambassadors manipulated the fragile court, playing rival nobles against each other. To the outside world, Spain appeared mighty, but within the palace, it was a crumbling stage where actors pretended their king was more than a shadow. The greatest deception was silence. No one would admit the truth, that Spain's future was dying in the body of its king. As the king grew older, his weakness deepened. He could barely walk, barely eat, and at times could not even speak. Physicians bled him, prayed over him, and fed him potions, but nothing slowed the decay. Still, there were brief moments of defiance. He tried to hold councils, to sign decrees, to prove he was more than a figurehead. But each attempt ended in exhaustion. His very existence was a struggle, a man fighting against his own collapsing body. Every passing year became a gamble. Would he survive long enough to secure an heir, or would the dynasty collapse with him? The whispers in Europe grew louder. Everyone waited for the inevitable. The end came quietly, almost mercifully. After years of agony, the king's frail body could no longer endure. He left behind no children, no successor from his line. With him, centuries of dynastic power dissolved into dust. But his death was more than personal tragedy. It was the death knell of an empire. His passing sparked wars of succession, battles for thrones, and decades of bloodshed across